Hello, and welcome to episode number 137 of A Mic on the Podium with me, Michael Seal. Today, I conduct a conversation with a British conductor who started out, like so many others, as a chorister. He went on to start his own orchestra in 2005 and now has a flourishing guest conducting career. He's also very well known as being the current head of conducting at the Royal College of Music in London. It's a great pleasure to welcome Toby Purser. Toby, it's been a little while since we chatted, but it's lovely to see you again today. How are you?
Mike, it's great to see you as well, and thanks for inviting me on. I'm very well, enjoying finally the arrival of summer in England.
It's, as we were saying before I pressed record, it's one of it feels like when I started this podcast, the first lockdown, red hot, can't have any fans on, can't have any windows open. It's a nice day today, really nice day. I always go back, because I know you've listened to a few, you've dipped in and out, and which is, thank you for doing so, of previous episodes. I go right back to the beginning. And as far back as I can go is that you were educated at Winchester College and you were a chorister there. But I don't know whether you come from a musical family and whether choristing was the first thing you did, instrument-wise. I don't know your instruments. Well, music, how did it appear in your life?
How did it start? Well, I was born near Winchester, and my family was not musical.
Right.
And my mother had played piano a bit when she was at school, and my grandfather, my mother's father, had also played piano at a sort of amateur level, but there were no musicians in the family. And I sort of got hooked by music quite early on, just by accident. And I have a couple of moments that I remember in my youth, which at the time meant nothing, but looking back on them, I realized that was it. That was when the seed was planted. And one was my parents had a tape of Giulini conducting Dvorak's New World Symphony. And I remember coming in once, I was leaping around the room listening to the scherzo. And my mother came and she said, "Oh, you're conducting." And I was very much, of course I'm not, don't be ridiculous. Yeah. But I was embarrassed, like all 5-year-olds would be, being discovered sort of being far too effusive in front of their parents. But that was one moment. And the other one was when I was at kindergarten. And this lady used to come in every week to play piano and for us to sing. And I used to just pull up a chair and sit next to her, peering at her fingers and galvanized by what she was doing. And I'd go home in the evening and tell my parents, "Oh, I had a lovely day. I've learnt this new song." And then when it came to the parents' evening at the end of the term, the teacher said to my parents, "Well, we don't think Toby's very musical because he's not remotely interested in music. He doesn't join in any of the songs." So my parents then said, "Oh, but he comes home every week and tells us exactly what song he's learned that day." So they quickly realized that I was really, really interested in the process of music making, and I was really captured by the piano, and piano became my instrument. To my I don't say disappointment, but in a sense, it's a little disappointing in the long run that I started playing the piano too late.
Right.
So that lady who came in to play at kindergarten became my first piano teacher, but she wouldn't accept any students until they were 8. And looking back on it, I think that was a bit too late for me to start. And I always struggled with my technique. And I had I went and studied, this is jumping ahead now, but when I was 18, I went and studied for a year in Vienna, studied piano as a gap year. And my teacher basically said, "You have no musical problems, it's just technique." And always my problems were technique. And when I was at school, playing in concerts, playing pieces which were way too hard than what I should have been playing. But you know how it is when you're that age, you have no idea what difficult is. You just think everything's possible.
Yeah.
So I was playing stuff which my fingers just couldn't keep up with my brain, basically, or my intention. So I always knew I wanted to be a musician. And I think at the beginning it was very instinctive, and it was just like I really connected to it. Whether it was also, trying to conduct with my mother's spaghetti and making a total mess in the kitchen, or those moments when they walked in on me jumping around the room to Dvorak 9. So my parents were amazing because they were not. I lost my parents 6 years ago, and looking back on them now, I appreciate so much more than I did at the time. The fact that without them being musicians, they supported kind of unquestioningly whatever I wanted to do in music. And if it was my music teacher saying Toby needs to go and study with Ilya Musin in St. Petersburg, as I did, or with George Hurst, all these things, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit later, they always said, okay, if that's what's best for you, we'll make it possible. And they were so generous and so supportive. And of course, I didn't appreciate it enough at the time. And I'm very grateful to have had parents like that. And as you mentioned in my intro, yes, I became a chorister. So I went to boarding school, probably, again, too young, at the age of 8, which is very young to be away from your family. But actually, I had a great time because I spent most of my time making music. And the lifeline for me was being a chorister. So every morning I was in the music room singing. And it's just such an amazing preparation for your musical awareness of all those things you need as a conductor, listening to one another, thinking ahead, thinking about phrasing, so many other things about, there's microcosm of society or that an orchestra is, but also a choir is. And responsibility, your responsibility to blend with the people around you, when to project, when it's your moment to come forward, when it's your moment to accompany. And again, I didn't intellectualize any of this at the time, but it just became my day-to-day, in my blood, basically, day-to-day. And alongside being a chorister, I also had access to really good music teachers. So it meant that I had my music lessons at Winchester College. And I had an amazing piano teacher there called Robert Bertone. And he's one of those people, you have certain people in your life who you form really life-changing relationships with, and he was kind of my first mentor, because the relationship you have with somebody who teaches you music goes so far beyond something which you put into words, because at every single moment in that one-to-one lesson, you're putting your heart on the table. That's
right.
You're opening yourself up to criticism. You're opening up to all your baggage, all the things you don't know how to express, all the parts of your psychology, of your personality, which maybe you haven't come to terms with yet, but somehow it all has to be at the service of the music. And what's the composer trying to say here? And how can you bring yourself to making that real, or making that honest?
I mean, that's very important in your teenage years, especially when we are searching for who we are and what we are and how we're going to conform or not conform or fit into the world. And you're during those surly years, or where you don't want to open your heart up, you go from being grumpy back to being a 9-year-old again. So you're right, you have those relationships with your music teachers where you have to open yourself up, both intellectually and through your heart and your soul, and because otherwise music won't happen. It doesn't happen.
Exactly. And I think it's a big leap of faith to actually, well, actually not a leap of faith, but it's a leap of courage to allow yourself to express what you think. And I'm sure in different cultures and different periods, it's a different challenge. So without naming countries, there are some cultures where it's really not considered good to express too much of what you think. And you really need to kind of remain under the radar. And to be honest, when I was at school, there were a lot of things. So anybody who was gay, might be bisexual or something, that was not spoken about. And to be honest, people who did put their heads above the parapet were teased pretty mercilessly. It was, people had come out of that with quite damaged, unless they had people around them who loved them and made them able to sort of get through that difficulty and find themselves and have the courage to be the person they were born to be. And that's, again, where I think mentorship, the right mentors, is so very important. I was in a school earlier this week, and it was just such a wonderful reminder of how things have changed, because I was in the dining room, and it's Pride Week at the moment in the UK, and there were all these pride flags all over the canteen. And I thought, how fantastic. God, it's just, and so those things are not a problem now.
No,
but, I mean, less so. Of course, there's still always some stigma involved, but it's just now different things are the challenge. Now we realize there are different parts of society which need to be improved and people need to be made aware of. And again, as conductors, that's such an important thing for us to bring bring ourselves to, because we're not just performing seals, no pun intended, I promise.
I know, but well done for being the first person in 134 episodes or whatever it is to use it.
But it is that thing about being aware of the culture we're in. How do we make the music of the 19th century or the 18th century relevant to a 21st century audience and society? And this is always a really exciting thing to be bringing our imagination and our experience to.
It's very true. I'm going to linger briefly on, because as you were talking about being a chorister, I just thought back and thought over the many episodes, so many people have come through the British chorister system that I could, off the top of my head, Ed Gardner, Mark Elder, Trevor Pinnock. I interviewed Chris Warren Green yesterday. He was a chorister as well. And there were many others going back through the list. And what a training it must be to have that. It's rigorousness of every morning in with the choir, learning new repertoire. But it's almost like speed learning as well, that you get miles ahead musically, just as you were talking about phrasing, about learning quickly, than you do with us just mere instrumentalists like myself. I didn't start playing the violin until I was 9. Yeah, what a great training, and and it's still there today, which is the good thing. Whereas all other areas and avenues of music education in the UK have dwindled, all of them, other than that chorister system.
That's right, and I think one of the things which British musicians are so famous for, of course, is our ability to sight read, and I'm sure the choral tradition has a big part to do with that, because you are having to sight read new music every single day.
Yes,
and be able to sing it perfectly. It means you have to have excellent rhythm. You have to be able to read quickly. You have to have good pitch, and actually, you also need to be able to follow a conductor.
Yes,
and so maybe the fact that I was standing in front of a conductor from the age of 8 and learning how to follow what these movements meant has an impact on my bringing it into my own physical language as well, as a sort of just a natural part of everyday life.
You said you had a gap year, which I didn't know about, before then going on to Oxford to read music. Did you just defer the place for a year to go and study the piano in Vienna, or how did it work?
Yes, I did. Well, there were a number of factors. One is that I was quite young for my year. So I was born at the end of June. So I was quite a young person in the year. But also I'd started conducting by a wonderful accident, which I have to tell you very, very quickly.
No, please do, because that was going to be my next question, was, when did the bug take hold?
Well, so I mentioned my parents before. So my grandfather, the one who also played a little bit of piano, was a fantastic gardener. And my parents inherited that love of gardening from him. And so I wanted to garden as well. And when I was at school, one of the most lovely men in the whole of the staff was the senior chaplain, and he used to run the gardening. So I thought, oh right, I want to do gardening, and I get to spend an afternoon a week with this amazing man. And so I went to one session of gardening. It was a once a week activity, sort of like community service. And so I went along for one session, and then I got told off by my piano teacher saying I was not to do gardening because it was bad for my wrists. And so I went to the head of the community services and said, I'm really sorry, but I've been told I've got to change to something else. What do you suggest? And he said, oh, well, a retired teacher has just moved into the area and wants somebody to go and visit once a week just for conversation. And there was a hospice quite near to the school called St. Cross. And a number of the college boys we'd get on our bicycles and go and visit these retired gentlemen. It wouldn't be allowed now, I'm sure, but just literally jumping on a bicycle, cycling off to a stranger's house.
Yeah.
And I went in and started having a nice chat, a cup of tea. And he suddenly says, what are you reading right now? I said, I'm reading a book by Sir Adrian Boult called The Point of the Stick.
Yeah.
And his eyes lit up and he said, Sir Adrian was my teacher. And he said, I used to be a conductor.
Oh, wow.
And if you bring a baton next week, I'll start teaching you how to conduct. And that's how it started. And I was already interested in conducting. I was reading about it. My parents had actually bought me a baton one Christmas. And so it all had started. And so every Wednesday afternoon, I went and spent 2 precious hours with this lovely man called Donald Leggett. And after about a year of him giving me some basic training, he said, I think you need to go and study with George Hurst. And because he said, I've taught you as much as I think I'm able to. You need to go to somebody now who really knows whether you have the potential to be a conductor or not. So George Hurst has set up this summer conducting masterclass called the Canford Summer School of Music.
Canford, yes, legendary.
Canford. Yeah. So at the age of 17, I went along for my first Canford, and it was a total revelation. Because up to that point, it took me many more years of Canford really to sort of, I think, to begin to understand what this thing of conducting actually was. But I started to realize how much more there was to it than just sort of thrashing around and getting excited by the music. And George was my most important mentor for the rest of his life. And I quickly he did realize I was a good pianist, so I became his class pianist. I then became his assistant later in life, and he gave me some, I don't know how to put this. George taught me so much, and I think my musical conscience was very much formed by him. He also gave me a lot of thought about how I did or didn't want to teach conducting myself, because I went through that process of teaching, which was also quite similar with Ilya Musin, who I went to later in St. Petersburg, which was very much that you copy their way of doing it.
Yes.
And that's I mean, and there's a very strong logic behind that, is, until you can do something better yourself, why not copy somebody who can do it?
Exactly. But
the reality is that can only take you so far, because you are basically copying somebody else's body language. And I might be fast forwarding to something you probably want to talk about later, because I am.
No, but we're bound to talk about it later, which is, you're head of conducting at the Royal College of Music, and it will come up. But it's good that it comes up here, because obviously one of my questions was going to be your style and your ethos as a teacher. Is it informed by who taught you? And so it's going to come up. So yeah, absolutely, it makes sense to talk about it now.
Well, I think it's very dangerous to emulate anybody else, of course. But that's the trouble with huge personalities. It's almost impossible not to, because you see them doing something and think, well, it can't be better than that. I'm so convinced that's the way I'm going to do it. And whether it's a teacher or whether it's seeing Carlos Kleiber doing Fledermaus Overture or Abado doing Mahler 9, it's like, that's the way to do it. But the trouble is, as soon as you try to copy their body language, everyone smells it a mile off. It's not genuine. And so after I'd studied with George Hurst and later Ilya Musin, I came back from St. Petersburg looking like because I've been copying Musin, I looked like a 94-year-old with arthritis. So I went to Colin Metters at the Royal Academy, where he was head of conducting, and I spent 3 years with him. And Colin, I think, is just the best. I think Colin is an absolute wonder, because he goes so far beneath your surface, and he manages to get you to throw away everything which is not genuine to yourself. But he also enabled me to identify what were the principles which unite George Hurst and Ilya Musin, and actually which I can then integrate into myself and make them my own. And now that was a very, very long, slow, painful process. And these things are very psychological, and like all things, we all develop at different speeds, and it's so important. And this is very central to my ethos of teaching conducting, is you cannot force things. You have to let people develop at the right speed and the right time for themselves. But
there are fundamentals there that we must all adhere to, whether that's technically with the stick or without the stick, or things you have to say, or things, times you have to butt in. All of these things are fundamentals that make, a conductor a conductor. But as you say, copying, I think it's part of the problem, actually. I'm going to focus in on one particular sentence you said, or half a sentence. It's the problem with Die Fledermaus Overture currently, is that everybody rehearses it too much to try and sound like Carlos Kleiber's version. They just do. I mean, when I was playing, I used to think, why are we rehearsing this so much? We've got the whole of the rest of the program to do. And then I started getting into conducting and watched the famous video and then various performances in Japan later on you can see on YouTube. And you suddenly think, oh, that's why. Yeah. And yeah, you're so right. Copying, somebody's, especially if you're up close like you were with George Hurst and with Musin, it's very easy for things to rub off on you, if not worse. You actually think I must do it like that, rather than it rubbing off.
Well, it's also because when you go to study with somebody, you believe in that person. You've chosen to study with them because you believe in them, and there is something like being a disciple in that, because and also if you go to a masterclass, it's like you pop in, and it's like if I'm giving a masterclass, it's a very different thing from mentoring somebody over a couple of years. So if you're giving a masterclass, you just give them as much as you can, and they can take it or leave it. And your main role is just to help as much as you can and hope that you can make a difference. The responsibility when you're looking after somebody over a long period of time is so different. And my hope is that when somebody gets to the end of 2 years studying me at the Royal College, that they don't look like me.
Yes.
And thankfully they all look different. And when I think of the students of Musin who've gone on to the biggest careers, they all look totally different because they found their way. So I think of Beechkov, Temirkanov, Gergiev, to mention 3 Russian ones, and of the British ones, I mean Martin Brabin, Sean Edwards, Stuart Stratford, Jerry Cornelius, me. we all look totally different.
Yeah.
But there are principles which unite us, and we found our way to make them our own. So I think you have to focus on that. What are the principles? What is it you can take from this in order to express your intentions in the most immediate, natural way possible? And that's basically where the book finishes, because after that, it's different for every individual. And so I think the more I mentor conductors, the more I realize how emotionally draining it is, because you need to be totally empathetic about how that person is reacting to every word you say, whether it's going too deep, whether it's because you don't want to push a nerve too hard and not damage somebody, but to inhibit them.
Yes,
it has to be a
not
way of
their
releasing.
confidence. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So of course constructive criticism is important, and sometimes a dose of tough love may also be necessary. But the English way of teaching it for sure is, I mean, we're always being told we're too nice. I certainly, when I started doing masterclasses, a few friends said, "Toby, you're too nice." They actually want you to be tougher. But that also applies to conducting. I mean, I remember I was doing some concerts in Russia, and I did the first couple of rehearsals, and it really wasn't going very well. And at one point, somebody at the back desk of the first, I was doing a piece by Tippett.
Right.
This is not really their normal repertoire. And at one point, they weren't getting a rhythm right, and I sang the rhythm the way it was supposed to be. It was a cross rhythm, and somebody at the back of the second said, "No, that's not right." And suddenly, I just lost it, and I had a massive. It's not like me at all, but I had a massive tantrum in Russian. I was very proud of that.
Oh, very good.
And I stormed out.
Yeah.
And I went and had a lovely lunch. And I decided I was going to go back after lunch. And I got back and I heard they were all practicing like crazy.
Yeah.
And I walked in, absolute silence. And after that was maestro this, maestro that. And I said to the leader, "What happened? Why did it take me having to have a tantrum for you to behave?" And she said, "We just wanted to see we just needed you to assert yourself more."
Oh, wow.
And so but there was a healthy dose of reality that different countries, different orchestras, you have to read the room.
Yes.
So if I'd behaved like that with a British orchestra, I could have waved goodbye to.
Oh God,
yeah. That would have been. Yeah. They'd have laughed in my face.
Yeah.
But with that orchestra at that moment, thankfully I made the right choice, which was to go and have an early lunch.
It's very, very, very true. I remember one orchestra, I got the feedback that I hadn't pushed them hard enough. for over some one or two particular moments. And I just felt that was also partly because there was an older generation in the room and a younger generation in the room, and it was actually the younger ones who wanted to be pushed, and the older ones were quite happy with me doing my normal, I trust you, you trust me, it'll all be fine. But yeah, it is very, very different from country to country, and orchestra to orchestra. How sometimes you can be more forthright and direct with what you say. Other times you do that and there's almost a gasp in the room because you've been too direct. And that's also part of the learning to be a conductor process, is realizing that you don't just go in and say the same thing every time in the same way. You have to learn that. You have to be able to read the room, smell the coffee, whatever it is. And it's different in every orchestra. I mean, the other thing I thought about the parallels, because I spent a long time, 10 years, teaching the violin at the Conservatoire in Birmingham. I always used to teach my students the fundamentals, so that when they left and they, let's say they got in an orchestra, which I would have been so proud of, and a couple of my students have, I wasn't going to get rung up every 5 minutes saying, and this is wrong with my playing, this hurts, that hurts. They had to be able to teach themselves by the time they left me. Having given them the fundamentals, then you go away and teach yourself, because as well as I do, when we're on the road guesting, or even in the middle of an opera run, if something's not working, you've got to figure out what to do with yourself to change it. You can't just, if I was your student, if I kept ringing you up saying, Toby, why isn't this not working, you'd get pretty pissed off eventually. And so you have to be able to teach yourself, and therefore the fundamentals are so important. But I like what you say about, give them the fundamentals, and it's also that it's tiring. It must be tiring. I know when I do it with my private pupils, but if you've got a class, you've got to get inside their head to work out what they're thinking about the music. It is tiring. But when you've got a class over 2 years, that's a very long, slow burn, isn't it?
It is, and I'm very aware if I take my finger off the button.
Yeah.
Because I'm in a very privileged position at the Royal College, because I'm one of 3 conducting professors. So we have 4 postgraduate conducting students, and between the 4 of them, they have 3 professors.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, as the 3 of us say to each other, they say, what's the best thing about conducting at the Royal College of Music? You have 3 professors. What's the worst thing about conducting at the Royal College of Music? You have 3 professors.
You have 3 professors. Yeah.
And you see, if you want to have somebody to teach you their way of doing it, that's not the place to come.
No.
But you need students who are already able to digest different opinions and choose what they want and choose what works for them. But the great thing is, my colleagues are Peter Stark and Howard Williams, and I think our approaches are very complementary. And we've all actually been taught at some point by or in contact with George Hurst. I'm the only Musin student, so that's an interesting discussion. But Martin Brabbins is also he's called our Prince Consort visiting professor, which means that he comes each term and works with the students and does concerts. And so he's obviously a pupil of Musin, and that's nice for me. So I feel very at home with that. And you mentioned about how tiring it is being empathetic all the time, but in a sense, because I have these colleagues, it takes a lot of weight off me, and it's a very privileged position because I actually don't have to be there all of the time. My contract is actually 2 days a week, and I can do that wherever I am in the world. So I don't always have to be in college for those 2 days a week, so long as I'm in communication and making sure I'm keeping an eye on things. So that enables me to carry on doing my other work, because my sort of red line that I would never cross is that my performing career comes first.
Yes. And
that's important for me as a teacher as well, because I don't want a student of mine to think, oh, he's just, sorry, this is an awful thing to say, just a teacher, because which is the most wonderful thing and so important. But I think the fact that I'm a performing musician is really important for them.
Yeah,
because it gives them an insight into the reality of the life of a conductor, the difficulties that and I share with them totally openly the mistakes I've made, the difficulties I have, things which are going well. I ask them to come and be my assistant, to attend rehearsals, because I think that's what I feel about my training was that it was very focused on the act of conducting,
Mm.
but it didn't really talk about how to rehearse, psychology, the business,
Yes.
finding an agent, how to network. And social media didn't really exist when I was a student, but now obviously it's a very, very important thing for people to be aware of.
Absolutely.
The industry.
Yeah.
And that's something which was never addressed when I was a student. It was all about, it was very pure. It was very spiritual, actually. And it was just all about, what is this wonderful mystic thing almost of conducting.
But there are so many other things. I mean, I do almost identical to that on my Patreon page. And dear listener, this is not a plug for my Patreon page. But what I do, and I have 6 young conductors who are on the top level, and they get so many hours a year conducting with me, and the phone is always on for them. If they've got a question, they can ring me, whatever else. But I also write tour diaries about what happens when you go away. Who books your flights? Who pays for your hotel? Who picks you up at the airport? And then I talk honestly and candidly, and I write it all down about every rehearsal I do. What worked, what didn't work. And so they can read this, and then they're welcome to find me a message on WhatsApp or write a comment underneath the article on Patreon so that the other Patreon subscribers can get involved. And it's proved to be very popular, but also quite eye-opening for some people that, I didn't realize that was how it worked. As you said, when you go to a conservatoire at any level and learn conducting, of course you learn all the technical stuff, but it's all of the add-ons, the peripheries, the other stuff that is actually helps you do your job properly when you stand on that podium with the score open in front of you. They're very important things.
Exactly. And I mean, Mike, what a wonderful thing you're doing with your Patreon page. I just think that's wonderful, because it's really hard, because you don't want to stand in front of a professional orchestra for the first time and get egg on your face, if you can possibly avoid it. And the first time I stood in front of a professional orchestra, I remember thinking I was swimming. I just didn't understand where anything was. And if you don't warn a young conductor what it's going to feel like, and just think that these are the things you need to look for. I mean, I'm the last one to talk. I still get it wrong 9 times out of 10, I'm sure. But I mean, funnily enough, the concerts I like most when I've only got one rehearsal.
Yes.
Because then you just have to be able to show it, and there's not much time to talk, and you just have to be really, really on it and really focused and helpful. It's when you have time that you can lose the orchestra, and that's the moment when you have to be so aware, such a good colleague. And that colleague actually is probably the most important word, because the thing, we all know there are lots of conductors with next to no technique in the sort of traditional sense.
Yes.
But the music just oozes out of them, so that you just know exactly what they want, and the results are simply mind-blowing. I mean, I think of Harnoncourt.
Yes, exactly. I
mean, you're one of my absolute favorite conductors,
but you would never teach his technique to anybody, or even advocate it to a degree. You just wouldn't.
Exactly that. So the thing about, it's probably even more of a case of singers, but I think it is the case for conductors too, that the person who's invited back is the one who's the best colleague. And people really ultimately don't care, was his technique a 9 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10. It's actually, was the music making really inspiring? Did they make us feel engaged? Did they make us feel that we played better than we were capable of without that person? And that's where it's all about psychology, and to use the same expression again, reading the room.
You're the first person to have ever broken down the word chemistry that I've used so often on this podcast, about the chemistry between an orchestra and a conductor, and vice versa. And actually to go down, just peel off one layer of that onion and say, no, it's about being a colleague. And I mean, that's why sometimes that chemistry isn't there. That collegiality is not there, because they don't get you, you don't get them, one or other, or both. And that's what, thank God there are hundreds of orchestras out there for us all to try to find our group of friends.
Absolutely. But also bear in mind that I think as conductors we can be quite defensive.
Yes,
so,
of course.
You're there you're on your island all on your own. And And if somebody criticizes you or you feel something negative coming towards you, the wall goes up.
Mm.
And, a great conductor is able to think, okay, I've got a problem there. I'm going to deal with it.
Yeah.
And they'll actually find a way to embrace that person in a warm way and make that wall evaporate, rather than just put a wall up in front of yourself and just be very stern and, by definition, not a colleague anymore.
And going back to your teaching, that's why keeping a performing career is important. And and again, I'm going to mention Patreon. The latest series I started was one called "What Would You Do in This Situation?" And it was inspired by an American conductor subscriber who sent me "What would you do?" Late one night on Facebook Messenger. Chris Russell sent me this scenario that he'd happened to him. And I thought, hey, this is a good idea, because we've all had those where you've had a player be aggressive towards you, or you've had a player ask you a question where whatever answer you give is going to give them fuel to a fire they might have across the other side of the orchestra. There's some leading question that's going to get you in the shit, frankly. And I think it's so important that by having that performing career, you can come back to your students when you're back in the UK and see them face to face and put that in front of them and say, this happened to me last week. What would you do? Don't tell them the answer. What would you do? And then make them think about it.
Yeah,
and without that performing career, it doesn't happen,
And they might have a better solution than the one I took.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly that. Yeah.
But actually, one of the things I love about teaching is we never stop learning. And that's always going to be the case for all of us. Anyone who's an artist, you never stop learning. You never feel you've achieved your potential. And I'm also learning a lot about teaching. And I only started the job at the Royal College 3 years ago, and that was at the beginning of COVID. So for 18 months it was a very different experience than the last 18 months. And bit by bit you find your way and develop alongside one another. And I think the interaction with your mentorees is a really, well, if it weren't so rewarding, we wouldn't do it.
No, exactly. No. We talked about performing careers, and we sort of leapt to the end of my questioning, and jumped over the fact that, eventually having read music at Oxford, and then went to the Royal Academy and had Colin Metters make you find yourself rather than find your mini Georges or your mini Ilias. You're basically involved with the foundation of, two orchestras. Wikipedia lists the Oxford Philharmonica as one that you helped set up. But then the big one is 05, where you founded the Orion Orchestra, which you still have a relationship with. In 2019, I would imagine you dropped down to being principal guest from being founder and music director. Why start an orchestra? I've asked this of everybody who's ever done it. I mean, the cynic would say, I need to conduct an orchestra. It's better if I've got my own, and then I know I'm going to guarantee to conduct it. But then there may well be other reasons for that.
No, it was basically that.
Right.
So the honest truth is that I'd been, now this is me slightly patting myself on the back, but it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Double-edged compliment, I mean. So I'd always been George Hurst's golden boy. And when I was with Ilya Musin, he was like, oh, Toby has everything, So I thought, okay, this is all going really well.
Yeah.
Went to the academy, became myself. And I just thought, okay, so what happens next? And I just thought that it was just going to carry on like that, all just being presented on a silver tray, that Toby is the one you want. And so the phone didn't ring. And I was conducting some amateur orchestras, some student orchestras, just things here and there, but things weren't developing. Looking back on it, realized that I wasn't ready at all. But that's maybe something we can talk about later. But after a few years, I was asked if I would be artistic director of a charity event called A Night Under the Stars, which was an annual event for the homeless for a charity called The Passage in London. And so for a couple of years, I was artistic director of it, and there wasn't an orchestra, but there were smaller venues, and we had some amazing singers and artists. And then we had a booking at the Royal Festival Hall. And I said, look, this is a really big venue. We really need an orchestra this time.
Yes.
And they said, fine, we'll put together an orchestra. So I put together an orchestra, and I thought, well, I need a suitably stellar name for it. So I called it Orion, for A Night Under the Stars. And so we did that one concert together. And I thought, oh, it was such an amazing orchestra. What a shame it can't continue, and we could do more concerts together. So 6 months later, I decided to do another concert and another charity concert. It was to help with humanitarian aid in Lebanon. And then the following year, there was another Night Under the Stars concert. And once I'd done those 3 concerts, and I had started inviting enough of my contacts who I thought might help sponsor some first concerts of our own. And so bit by bit, I managed to build up some supporters and some backing and put together my own orchestra. But the honest reality is, yes, I said it became a charity, and the intention was very much, and is still very much, to provide a stepping stone orchestral opportunity for students who are just leaving music college, and as they, bridging the gap between music college and their musical professional careers. But it was also serving a really important service for myself, which was I needed a springboard. I needed a window where I could be seen, basically.
Absolutely, yeah, we all do. People. Yeah.
So that was quite simply a career move. And I mean, so many conductors have done that, of course. I mean, think of Richard Hickox, and I learned so much from doing it. One of the things I never got taught properly when I was at music college was how to rehearse. So having an orchestra to rehearse regularly helped a lot. I was also a principal conductor of another orchestra in North London called the London International Orchestra, and that was a weekly rehearsal as well. And I had lots of professional musicians in it, or retired professionals in it. So I got all these people who had been principal bass of Covent Garden and principal clarinet of Covent Garden and a viola from the RPO, and so there were lots of really wonderful people in it who actually gave me really helpful feedback, but also came just because they wanted to play for enjoyment. So it was interesting. There were lots of professionals who had stopped playing professionally but wanted just to come and play for fun. And so that also is something I'm so grateful for, because I managed to get through such a lot of core rep. And so when I'm doing these, one rehearsal kind of gigs, the fact that I had that training of doing all these big gala programs and all the rep you get on these typical sort of very popular classical music programs, I had a chance to try out lots of times with this other orchestra, because that's the other difficulty, is what happens to a young conductor if they've never conducted a Brahms Symphony No. 2, and suddenly they get an invitation from a really top-notch orchestra to go and do it with them. I mean, that's not a good place to try out Brahms 2 for the first time.
Definitely not. I mean, the second movement actually came as somebody's answer to the hardest piece they've ever conducted recently, and I nodded away in very much an agreement that it is bloody hard, and I'm very glad that I tried it out on a couple of amateur orchestras first before having done it. You're absolutely right. It's so important that you also, going back to those ex-pros are the who then want to carry on playing for their own enjoyment's sake. They're quite rare, but therefore that they're the sort of people who give you honest feedback, because they still enjoy playing and they enjoy the process and they enjoy orchestras. Therefore, by sheer dint of those facts, they're not conductor haters. They're likely to come to you and give you honest advice, and it's worth its weight in gold.
You're very right. You're very right. Yeah. Very, very happy.
Even during my 22 years in the CBSO, I could tell you the players who were conductor haters, didn't matter who stood up there, even down to Rattle and Oromo and the people that we had as boss. Whereas the others who were genuinely interested. So when I started conducting them, in 2005, and I did, 9 years both as a violinist and a conductor, I knew the people whose advice I could listen to, because I knew that they were interested in the process and the music making, and they weren't just a hater of everybody who held a baton in their left or right hand. It's important that you get all of that through whatever process.
Well, it's also so interesting, isn't it, the way as a conductor you take and welcome advice from an orchestra member but then how to interpret it.
Yes.
Because, and there's that wonderful book by Mark Wigglesworth, the silent musician, and he got one of the orchestras he was conducting to write down a list of adjectives of the qualities that they thought a conductor needed to possess.
Yeah.
And there's about a page or 2 pages of them, and they're so contradictory. And you just basically have to be all things to all men and women at all times.
Dear listener, go back to the Mark Wigglesworth episode, because at some point I read out the entire list that he quoted. I broke the episode up and I read out every single word, and it's fascinating. It really is fascinating because they're so contradictory.
It's also one of the best books about conducting.
Yes,
I've read, because it's not about how to conduct; it's about why we conduct.
Yes,
and why there is a conductor, and that's something I think is not thought about enough by conducting students, because they're very focused on the grammar of conducting, but the philosophical side of it is so important. And why I got distracted? Oh yes, the way to interpret information from an orchestra member. And so very often, I mean, I'm sure every conductor listening to this will identify when they've been told they're trying to be musical, and somebody says, "Excuse me, can you just give us a clearer first beat?" Give us that. and it's so hard not to snap and say, "I'm trying my best." But the reality is that, well, we're clearly not providing something they do need. So I think the reality is that so much of the information which we communicate as conductors is not consciously analyzed by an orchestra player. And that's partly also the way that information goes in faster from what's it called, side vision or peripheral vision, than if you look straight at somebody. If you look straight at somebody, you have to analyze what they're doing. The brain analyzes. It takes a nanosecond longer. And so peripheral vision actually goes much, much deeper into the emotions than something which you have to analyze. So I think a lot of the information we're communicating is not actually consciously noticed by members of the orchestra.
Oh, absolutely, I agree with that. Yeah, totally.
But it means that when somebody's not getting a rhythmic clarity they want from you at a certain moment, they say, "Oh, I need a clearer first beat there." And so eventually, I've managed to find that if somebody now says to me, "Can you be a bit clearer there?" I'm no longer, I don't get uppity like I used to and think, "Well, go, you try." And I wouldn't ever say that you try and do it, because you're trying to do something you're trying to be musical. You're trying to do what you think is the most important thing at that moment. I think it's a case of providing a musical clarity. Well, it's 2 things. If you're totally clear musically, there will never be an issue about what your intention is and but also it's also about turning the table and thinking, if I was sitting in the position of that percussionist, what do they need from me at that moment? What is it they need from me? It's not about what's the sunrise, or what's the atmosphere, how much swell is there in the sea at this moment. It's also, actually, I need to play a really difficult cross rhythm. What does that musician need from me at this moment? So that, and this comes into how we study our scores also. It's that
it does very much so.
That identification with what the orchestra needs from us at each particular moment, because as conductors, yes, we're leaders, but it's a very particular kind of leadership, and I think it has to be servant leadership on the level of serving the composer first of all, and secondly serving the orchestra, and never serving ourselves. But you can always spot there are some quite impressive looking conductors out there on YouTube who are clearly serving themselves.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, exactly. I mean, I always say to my students that everything that you do with your hands and arms and your face and your gestures goes forwards into the orchestra 100% of the time. However, occasionally you might do a gesture which helps somebody in the percussion, or helps somebody in the brass, or helps somebody on the peripherals of the orchestra, which as a byproduct goes backwards into the audience. So the audience, because there are people in the audience who sit and watch the conductor and nothing else. I said, no, but you should never ever think backwards first. It's always forwards. But if you happen to do a gesture in that particular way, then an audience member might go, "Oh, that's thrilling and exciting," But everything goes forwards, 100%. Never, ever, ever, think about serving yourself, or that's going to look pretty to the people who pay the money behind me. That
Exactly.
Occasionally there's a byproduct that it does, but never search for that. That's the whole point. Can I briefly go to opera? Because your CV is littered with opera companies. You're music director of the New Sussex Opera, and between 2016 and 2018, you're the Ian O'Macarus Conducting Fellow. Was opera something you always wanted to do since, founding the Orion all those years ago in 2005? Or is it just something that sort of slowly, gently morphed into something that you do quite a lot of?
It actually, it was a bit of a slow morph.
Right.
But once it started, I absolutely got the bug, and I love opera with an absolute passion. And I in an ideal world, I would like to say that I do 50-50 symphonic and operatic work, because I think the two help each other so much.
Very much so.
So my training was really purely symphonic. With George Hurst and Ilya Musin was really only symphonic repertoire. But because I was a good pianist, I used to get asked to come and play for auditions quite often for singers and for opera companies. And then that led to me doing some répétiteur work for, funnily enough, the pianist who I took over from, who used to be George Hurst's pianist, a wonderful musician called Jeremy Silver, who now lives in South Africa. And so I took over. So Jeremy gave me my first job as a répétiteur, and then I assisted him. And then I did some work with what's it called? British Youth Opera, a couple of seasons. So this was my kind of introduction into opera. And while I was at the academy, we also conducted opera scenes. But I have to say, with all honesty, nobody really oversaw me when I was subjecting these singers to my conducting. I mean, and so thankfully, it didn't seem to go too badly. But it was a very case of just go in the pit and do it.
Yeah.
And so I think when I really got the bug was actually thanks to Wasfi Carney, who ran the then Grange Park Opera, which was down in Twyford, and she now runs another opera company, which is also called Grange Park Opera, but is near Guildford. But so I met Wasfi because I was invited to be assistant conductor on Prokofiev's The Gambler. And that went quite well. And she asked me to go back the second year as chorus master as well as assistant. And then in between, she said, "Toby, we're doing a West Side Story in Wandsworth Prison. Oh no, I've got it wrong. We're doing Sweeney Todd,
right,
in Portsmouth Prison.
Yeah.
Will I conduct it? And will I be music director?" And it wasn't just we're doing it in the prison. We were doing it with the prisoners. And
brilliant.
This is something called Pimlico Opera, and I said, "Oh, but Wasfi, they'll eat me alive, with my plummy accent and all this kind of thing. They'll just make." And she gave me the best advice ever. She said, "Toby, so long as you don't think you're better than them, and you're there to help them, you won't have any problems." That bit of advice went straight to my heart. I said, "Yep, I'll do it."
Yeah.
And she was totally right. I mean, yes, I got a bit of ribbing for my accent occasionally, but because I could laugh with them, and I have no problem with making fun of myself. It's so that was not a problem. So actually, they also saw that I was there because I genuinely cared about helping them. And I have to say, the first time hearing a room full of prisoners singing Sweeney Todd was one of the most goose pimple inducing moments of my entire musical life.
Yeah.
And then after that we did West Side Story in Wandsworth, quite a lot of different musicals. I did that for about 6 years.
Yeah.
And it totally changed my perception on so many different levels about who I am, how fortunate I am. It made me realize how fortunate I am, because there were so many people I encountered in prison who had never been given any encouragement, never been told that they had talent, that they had potential, that they had the possibility to be something greater.
Yes.
than themselves by working together with other people. And I mean, some of the talent we uncovered was simply extraordinary. And I would say that 90% of the people I encountered were there because of drugs.
Right. Yeah.
And so when I was at university, I'm sure you kind of think, oh, drugs, isn't that just like alcohol? And you don't really think it's such a big deal. But actually having encountered those people in prison who were there because of an addiction, or because they were dealing, or because they, whatever circumstances led them to that dark place in their lives, I realized that well, there's absolutely zero, what's the expression, a zero tolerance policy on drugs.
Yes.
But also it was just the realization that somebody like me, who was given such incredible opportunity by very generous parents, and being sent to schools where music was encouraged, and where actually me sitting in a room playing the piano for 6 hours a day wasn't considered weird, but actually just encouraged.
Yeah.
I was that was just so fortunate, and so many people don't have that opportunity, and that's also why it's such a tragedy that the level of music education in this country is being so destroyed by lack of funding. And it's not only lack of funding, it's also the way that the government doesn't seem to think culture really matters.
Yeah, it's lack of any sort of encouragement or advocacy. We'll just let it get on with itself. It seems to have coped so far.
Yeah.
And when we need it, we will hold that flag up in the air and go, look at how brilliant we are, and not tell everybody we haven't been funding it for the last 15, 20 years.
I know.
Whatever it is.
And the trouble is, we're also passionate about it, that we get on and make it happen anyway.
Yes, despite it, exactly. Yeah.
And so well, it's all right. They seem to be doing all right. Yeah.
Yeah. Toby, the first time I really encountered you was a group that you set up, and I joined way too late because I had my head in the sand starting this podcast, which was called Conductors in Isolation, which started during the first COVID lockdown and is still going on now. How did the idea come about? As I said, I wished I'd known about it from the start. I'd have joined at the beginning and been there every night at 6 o'clock with your meetings online. But how did the idea come to you? And what do you think? Because, as I said, it's still going on now, and I still get regular little things pop up on my phone saying that somebody's posted. What's the legacy of it?
Gosh, the legacy. Well, that connects to something which I think is one of the hardest things about being a conductor, which is the loneliness.
Yes.
And if there was any time when I felt, through good fortune, I could use my new position at the Royal College and the profile that gave me to bring together conductors at a moment of worldwide hardship, it was the beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And on the first day of the pandemic, I just sent, well, actually not the first day of the pandemic, that's a ridiculous thing to say. On the first day of lockdown, the first lockdown in the UK, I sent a message on Facebook to about 40 conductor friends, and I said, should we just have a Zoom call this evening and just have a little catch up?
Yeah.
And they all kind of logged on, and we had an amazing conversation. I said, well, look, why don't we do this every day?
Yeah.
And let's call it Conductors in Isolation. It was just one of those moments that's the name, Conductors in Isolation. So I set up a Facebook page, Facebook group, and every member of those 40 invited their friends, and it kind of snowballed. And every day of the week, Monday to Saturday, we had Sundays off. Monday to Saturday, we had meetings, and those meetings were generally interviews, discussions, themed discussions.
Yes.
Presentations. Sometimes they were score study, and very often, and more times than not, I would lead the interviews and give some of the presentations. But there's a limit to how much you can do. And once we were getting on to over a year, you start running out of ideas. And what was wonderful was the number of there was a real core of conductors who kind of were there every single session and were just amazing at contributing.
Mm.
And so they would often lead sessions on, for example, there was 3 days on Freemasonry and the magic flute. John Longstaff did a wonderful series of talks about how to approach rehearsing Messiah, because most conductors will have to rehearse Handel's Messiah at some point, but they won't, but probably not have had a chance to really discuss all the difficulties among one another. So the real legacy was building up a community of conductors, knowing that they can talk to one another and ask for advice. And if there's one thing, and I know this is a question you're going to ask me at the end, but I'm going to answer it now. If there's one thing I could change about conducting, it's the fact that we don't talk to each other enough.
No.
And I think it takes a brave conductor to ask another conductor to give them advice or feedback. But every singer does it, and every singer has a coach.
Yes.
And every instrumentalist will probably, go to people they ask for technical advice. But somehow, because our body language as conductors is so individual and personal, I think we're a little bit less, maybe a little bit more cagey about asking somebody else whose own technique and body language has developed in such a way that it may be different. So you have to choose the people you ask for advice very, very carefully. But so the legacy of Conductors in Isolation is what I feel needs to be changed in the conducting world in general, which is that we're not just that lone, isolated individual on the podium, but actually we're all there to support one another and to learn from one another.
Yeah, well, I agree with you completely. I mean, it sort of, I had the same thought myself, which is I sat there and thought, what are all the other conductors doing? And then I had a different light bulb go off and go, hey, hang on a minute. This is the first time in history that they're all sitting home doing nothing. I might be able to interview some of them just for a podcast, for something to do to keep me sane. But actually, what's happened is that all of those early interviews and virtually every interview afterwards, after I've pressed stop, the person I've been interviewing says, oh, that was so much fun. It's just great just to talk about what we do with another conductor. And your group was exactly that. I mean, it's still going today. Regularly somebody will pop up and say, anybody know where I can get hold of this score? Or what about this particular note in this particular chord? Don't you think that's a misprint? I did a couple of those sessions, as you know. I did one on Shostakovich 9. I did one on a rehearsal order for a John Williams concert with the RPO, but also if you had a rehearsal day, nuts and boltsy stuff. And thoroughly enjoyed it. And what was great was in both of those, I had really serious questions as to why I did it my way, or had I thought about doing it in another way, or compliments or whatever it is, and say, oh, I'd never thought of that. Thank you for letting me know that. And it's just being willing to share and be open. And not just as a teacher, which you are and I am, but many of the people on that group don't teach other people. But and I'm sure, like we all do, they sat there feeling isolated, feeling alone, and now to be able to connect with a group of conductors is wonderful. I mean, there's well over 1,000 members, isn't there, on there?
1,800.
Wow.
But the dilemma now is what happens next. And to be honest, that's a question I tried to answer about a year ago, and I don't feel I've succeeded in carrying it through. And so I feel that Conductors in Isolation needs to carry on as not just, so it remains as a Facebook forum, a Facebook group where people talk to one another and ask questions, but we even have the Zoom meetings are still available every Wednesday and Saturday evening. If any conductors want to log on, they can log on and they can talk to one another. I left that kind of in perpetuity, but what's not happening is I've just simply not had any time to log on myself.
No.
And I don't have time to organize the sessions anymore. I think what I need is a couple of ambitious young conductors who want to take it over.
Yes.
And
a couple of young Padawans who will take on the job.
Exactly. But quite genuinely, I think it would be wonderful if it could be an active forum providing the kind of feedback and advice young conductors especially, or I should say early career conductors especially, need, because there are lots of questions which I know I was able to answer. People think of applying to music college, trying to decide on what direction their conducting career should go. Which, is it going to the opera route? Is it going to music college? Is it going freestyle? And that was possible to answer with a whole wealth of people joining who could give their input. People from the German opera houses, people from different countries, and of course people from UK conservatoires. So I would love to see that becoming actually slightly more active, because what I don't want is it to become just stagnate, because we all rejoin the rat race and going round and round on the wheel, and it's so easy to lose sight of what's really important. And obviously music's the most important thing of all for most of us who are doing a vocational career, but also the human interaction is so important, and we don't all want to be in an ivory tower.
No. There is an 11th question, which I'm sure you know about, which is about score study and preparation. And I always ask, do you sit at your piano, or do you use your inner ear, or a combination of both? Big to small, global view down to the minute details, or start at the beginning and work your way through? And are you a scribbler inner? Are you a red, blue, black? And also, in brackets, sub-question, is it something you discuss with your students at the RCM about score studying and marking? Studying, obviously. Marking, different topic.
It depends.
Yeah.
It's one of those questions which is a yes and no. So I don't mark very much in my scores. But what I mark has changed over the years. So if I look back over a score I was studying when I was at music college, I look at it and it just looks like a load of garbage. It just seems so unstructured and disorganized. And I think, did I have any idea what this piece was about? But I've studied the scores of some other great conductors. Like I used to study Scholti's scores, for example.
Yes.
And some of them you can hardly see the notes through this incredibly frenetic sort of scribbling and 1,000 metronome marks crossed out and written different ones. We're talking about 108 crossed out and replaced with 109, crossed out and replaced with 107. So you discover probably more about the conductor than you do about actually the core, the heart of the music.
Yeah. It's
like, if after I die, I don't think my scores are of any use to anybody, because it won't tell you anything about my approach to them. They'll be perfectly useful for somebody to use and rub out my markings, because I don't think there's anything valuable in them.
Right.
But so anything I write in the score is normally just simply to add to act as a aide-memoire.
Yeah.
That when I glance down, I can see in one glance everything I need to know about that page. So at the moment, I tend to, I'm trying to think where to start this discussion from. I think at the moment, I start by reading through the whole score very, very fast. Get an overview. In fact, and this is something I got from the Adrian Bolt book, back when I was a schoolboy.
Yeah.
He's saying sort of, read through it really fast, so you have a view like an eagle flying over the music and over the landscape. And then I gradually go slower and slower. But the next thing I do is actually I mark in bar lengths.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, phrase lengths.
Phrase lengths, yeah.
Now I know that's a bit dangerous, because I don't like the idea of cutting up something which is a very organic form into something which is bricky.
Yes.
But I do find it helps me to identify the architecture of the music. And it's very helpful for me to know when a composer deviates from, if you accept that the composer normally writes in 4-bar phrases, that when they add a 5-bar phrase or a 7-bar phrase, that it's interesting.
Yes.
And that there's a reason why. So the thing I'm looking for most when I study a score is to ask the question, why did he write this? Or why does she write this? And asking myself the right questions, which will enable me to find my answers for what the composer was intending. And the more I study the score, the easier it becomes to find the right questions to ask.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean necessarily finding the right answers.
No. Yeah.
I mean, because every question you ask, I'll find at least 5 answers. And that's when recordings then become very useful.
Yeah.
And I have no shame at all about listening to recordings. I know some conductors say, "Oh, I don't listen to recordings." I think it's absolute nonsense. Of course they do.
Honestly, not many on here have said that. A couple only. I have had one conductor say, if anybody tells you they don't listen to recordings, they're liars. He wasn't saying that they might be lying. He just went straight down the line and said, they're liars. I'm with you. I mean, you'd be stupid not to inform yourself with what the greats of the past have done in their recordings. And often they recorded it 2 or 3 times. And as Simon Rattle says, they're postcards from your life. That views may change over the years, but you'd be stupid not to.
Exactly. And I mean, who doesn't want to get a free lesson from a great conductor?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's wonderful. But the trouble is that they normally find a different solution to one of the 5 you might have been thinking of. So it actually poses even more questions that you might not have thought about. So I find that when I'm studying a score, there's a period about halfway through where I am absolutely buried in confusion, in not knowing what my decisions are going to be, because I'm just aware, and that's where I kind of want to scream, help, I need conductors in isolation. Or I need a conductor friend who I can say, can I talk this through with you? And then it starts getting easier, because I really, this is what my instincts are telling me is what Brahms means here. And once you've started building what it is you believe in, then the other parts start falling into place. And then I start reading the score through faster and getting more of a sense of the flow and the ebb and flow and the overall direction of the music. I'm quite obsessed by harmony, so I will analyze the harmony in quite a detailed way, and that's also partly because I think harmony is something which wasn't spoken about to me enough when I was a student.
Me too.
And I now think that harmony is the most important thing. I think it's the most interesting thing. It's a lot more interesting than melody, because a melody on its own without the right harmony is meaningless.
Absolutely. A melody can be something completely different with a different set of harmony underneath it. That's exactly the whole point. Yeah.
And that's why Mozart is my favorite composer, because he somehow in this godlike way manages to connect to us as human beings, but also express so many aspects of what it is to be alive in all of its difficulties and joys. By just, it could be one viola note, which just inflects something, and I don't know, it can just give a moment of feeling, a feeling of decay or of anguish or of bittersweetness, or in something sad, it can be a moment which actually makes you feel that there's consolation and there's hope. And I find Mozart's humanity all the more miraculous from the fact that he's writing within such a mostly classical harmonic language.
Are you a young conductor, thirsty for knowledge and wanting to discover more about the world of conducting? Then my Patreon page is there for you. I'm constantly posting new content there based on my experiences as a conductor and an ex-orchestral player. And I offer you the chance to ask me any question any time of the day. For instance, you might like to ask me how to mark up a score, as we've just been discussing. When you subscribe, you will gain access to interviews, video posts, tour diaries, articles, and much more. If you pay for the whole year, then you will gain a 10% discount, and if you are a student, contact me directly and there will be a further discount. All of this can be found at patreon.com/Mike on the Podium. And from just £5 a month, you can gain access to this ever-growing resource on conductors and conducting. That's patreon.com. Details and links to the page are in the show notes attached to this episode. Now, the all-important 10 questions with my guest, Toby Purser. Toby, it's time for the 10 questions. And as you know, I always start with what sound or noise do you love and what sound or noise do you hate?
I've been dreading these 10 questions. I knew they were coming. It's so hard because there are so many sounds I love and so many sounds I hate.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, you know what? The sound I love most is the sound of a blackbird. Because it's something I only grew to love quite recently. And somebody pointed out, she said, "Can you hear the blackbird up there?" And I didn't realize that this was the song of the blackbird. Yeah. And then I realized that this beautiful bird flies to the highest point it can find, and sings its heart out. I just love the fact that it's not just that it's singing its heart out. It's just so beautiful. So when I hear a blackbird, I smile inwardly and outwardly.
Brilliant answer. And a sound you hate or dislike intensely?
This was even harder than finding something I like, actually, because I was thinking, oh, all the normal things. I hate background music. I hate the sound of metal against metal. You know, like when you're waiting for the underground and the train scrapes in. But I thought, no, on an emotional level, the thing which pains me the most is the sound of somebody crying. And it's not the sound itself; it's the fact that somebody is in deep pain and you're not able to help them.
Yes.
And you might be able to offer them consolation, but even then, are you allowed to? Is that the right thing to do? Yeah. So there's this huge inward uncertainty. What's the right thing to do? And also, even if you offer someone consolation, you know that you can't solve anything. And with all the other nasty sounds, you can ask somebody to turn off the music. You can stop the clock, which is ticking away and disrupting your inner pulse when you're studying a score. That's another sound I hate, by the way. But yeah, so I would say the sound of somebody crying.
It's a very, very good answer, and one I'm sure I haven't had before, with quite such excellently thought through processes attached to it as well, which I completely agree with. Number 3 is, if you had 24 hours free, what would you spend it doing?
I feel that one of the things which has suffered most in my life as a conductor is my friendships. So what I would do, and I love cooking, by the way. So what I would do is I would spend 24 hours, of which at least the first 6 would be going shopping and buying the most amazing food. And I would spend the afternoon cooking. And then I would invite the people I love most to come and spend the rest of the 24 hours together.
Brilliant. And the reason why I say brilliant is because I know now the answer to question 10 is going to be interesting and well thought through. I don't always know that, but actually a very dear friend of mine, who shall remain anonymous, very dear friend of mine who's a presenter and a classical and a percussionist in the music business in the UK. He's listened to every episode, and he says that he always tries to work out through questions 1 to 9 whether question 10 is going to be interesting or not, because he's a foodie like me. So yeah, he's probably going to get a tip off that your question 10 answer is going to be good.
He's going to be very disappointed.
Well, right. Question 4 is, can you name your favourite conductor or conductors of yesteryear?
Well, it's too obvious to say Carlos Kleiber and Claudio Abbado, I think, because they're almost, well, those 2 are my kind of gods.
Yeah.
I think they're just in another league. And there are so many great conductors, and it's impossible to put myself to one. I want to stick up for, I think, a great underrated conductor, who is Rudolf Kemper.
Oh, now there's a name who's barely appeared, if ever appeared. And I agree with you. Absolutely agree with you.
And part of the reason is because he's a conductor whose performances I'm gradually listening to more and more at the moment. And every musician I've ever spoken to who ever played under him always says, oh, well, we love playing under so-and-so. But Kemper.
Yeah.
Kemper was the one. We loved Kemper. And it was just such admiration and respect and love. And he has the qualities which I most look for in a conductor, which are truthfulness and integrity.
Question 5, as you know, can be considered a more tricky question. Other people don't think it's tricky at all. Can you name your favourite current conductor or conductors?
Well, it's hard to say favourite. Herbert Blomstedt is a conductor who I've never seen conduct live, and I'm absolutely determined to see him conduct before his 100th birthday. So he is there with somebody I admire beyond words, and I adore, even without having seen him live. So that's something I need to remedy. But I decided to actually pick, for the conductor I most admire, Mark Wigglesworth.
Yes. Because
Mark is somebody whose integrity and honesty I think go beyond, well, put it this way, it's what I would aspire to be myself. And I've assisted Mark on a number of occasions, and he has similarities in his background to me, including having studied with George Hurst. And so the process he went through in order to free himself and become the conductor he is something I relate to very much. And also, he's a great thinker. His book is superb. His articles are always so insightful and genuine and engaging. So as an all-round musician and a conductor who I love assisting, because when you're assisting Mark, you're made to feel as an equal to him. It's extraordinary. He really generally wants to know your feedback. And when you give it to him, he will conduct differently in the concert. And you'll hear that your suggestions have been integrated into a, and it's incredible honor when you realize that you've been a part of a conductor's final performance. So as a conductor I admire in so many different ways, I would nominate Mark Wigglesworth.
What is the hardest work you've ever conducted?
I have to say Lulu by Alban Berg. It's and funnily enough, I assisted Mark Wigglesworth on it. And yes, the reason I find it the hardest piece I ever conducted, and I have to be honest, I didn't conduct a performance, but I conducted a studio run, and it was assisting at English National Opera, and I think it was the hardest piece I've ever conducted because I hated it when I started learning it. And I thought, I'm never going to be able to grow to love this piece. But by the end, boy, did I love it. But it took me such a lot of effort to find my way into it. To find myself into that sound world, but also massive structures. I mean, every bar had a different kind of technical challenge, but you had this amazing musical palindrome, which Mark used to get me. This was something I really enjoyed. Before every performance, he used to ask me to go through the whole of the palindrome with the singers. So I got to conduct that bit about I don't know how many times, at least a dozen times. And it's amazing because you start so slowly, and you get gradually faster and faster, about 8-minute accelerando or something like that, and then you gradually get slower. It's much harder slowing down than accelerating.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that the accelerating, you can somehow, that just has a natural momentum. But with the slowing down, it's very easy not to slow. It's quite difficult not to slow down too quickly.
Yes.
It's a very interesting process. But yes, I think Alban Berg was one of the most challenging pieces for me to work, partly because I had to grow to love it.
Number 7 is, when traveling abroad to conduct, what item could you not leave home without?
My gym kit. That is not the answer I would have given 2 years ago.
No, right, okay.
Or pre-COVID.
Yeah.
And so the answer I actually was going to give you was a book, because you spend so much time, a good novel, because you spend so much time on your own in a rehearsal room after, and you need something to occupy yourself, or else it's just really lonely. And I thought, well, and I always need a novel to read. But then I thought, well, God, it's so isolating to be, stuck in your hotel room reading a book. So the other thing I do, so I've taken up rowing, and I love it. I absolutely love it. And it's there are so many similarities with rowing and conducting. And normally, so they've worked out at my rowing club that I've got good rhythm. Right. So they normally put me in stroke, which is the rower who sits in front of the other rowers.
Yes.
And so I set the rhythm
that
everyone else has to follow, set the pace. And there are so many similarities with conducting, because you have to be feeling the whole boat. You have to be aware of whether they're in synchronization with you. The difference is you're not allowed to adapt. So with conducting, you're always accommodating individuality.
Yes.
And absolutely encouraging that and the flexibility. With the rowing, you have to show very strong leadership. But actually you don't deviate from that rhythm. They absolutely have. And there have been plenty of conductors who have been like that. I mean, I remember seeing a performance nearly fall apart conducted by Colin Davis, who was a very flexible conductor. But there was one point when he said, basically, you can fall apart if you want to. This is my tempo. I'm carrying on. And rowing is, but it's also so much about responsibility. You have to take responsibility. You cannot flag, because if you don't put in 100% effort and remain focused at every moment, you will screw up.
Yeah.
And you'll not screw it up for yourself, you screw it up for everybody.
Everybody behind you, yeah.
And
yeah.
everyone behind you. And that's just like conducting, basically. So I love the fact that there are similarities, but also when I'm rowing, it takes me away from music. It takes me away from the stress and thinking about music, because you can, if you don't think about that one thing in a kind of trance, it's very meditative, then you'll make a mistake. So I like the fact that it gives me a real escape from everyday life.
I've had gym kit or gym clothes or running shoes, but I'm not sure I've had a rower. I've got a rowing machine in my study right here, but I've got dodgy knees at the moment, so I'm not getting on it. But it was also something I did during lockdown to try and lose a bit of weight, which, partially succeeded. But yeah, I can see the fascination in it, and I enjoy your analogies with conducting very much. As somebody who's into their sport, I understand what you're talking about. Number 8 has been answered earlier on in the podcast. So we're going to jump to number 9, which is, what profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
I'd love to be a psychologist, because, well, actually, when I was at school, you have that moment when you have to decide what you're going to do at university.
Yes.
I was very interested in psychology, and I think psychology is such a big, it's probably 90% of what conductors do anyway.
Yeah.
Because it involves a lot of empathy, and it also has a huge amount of responsibility attached to it. And so if I lost the use of my limbs or decided that music wasn't for me anymore, I would love to be a psychologist.
Very good answer. And I agree. Again, it is so much of what we do. So much of what we do when we're doing it. The problem is that 90% of what we do is actually, a lot of the time is spent sitting on our own in a room looking at a score with our pencils in our hand. But yeah, when we're actually doing it, 90% of what we do is psychology.
Exactly.
Absolutely agree. As I said earlier, when you gave me your answer to question number 3, I was looking forward to question number 10. So here it is. If the world were to end tonight, what would be your choice of final meal and drink?
Well, despite the fact that I said that I would spend most of the day cooking and shopping, the reality is what I love most of all is really wonderful ingredients cooked simply.
Yes.
So I love Italian cooking, for example, because of that focus on fresh produce and cooked so that the natural flavors absolutely sing. So my final meal would be some oysters.
Yeah. Lovely.
Some locally grown asparagus.
Oh.
Perhaps a Dover sole. But seafood is my favorite, by the way.
That's coming through.
Dover sole, I guess. I need something else in here somewhere, but Dover sole or turbot, something like that. And actually, my favorite pudding is I was thinking, what would I most like for my final thing I ever eat? Strawberries.
Yeah.
Cream has to be with cream. To be with cream. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And with all of that seafood, are we going for a crisp white wine, or are we having different drinks with different courses?
I hadn't thought through the wine list. But I would definitely. So I would with the Dover sole, I would go for a lovely white Burgundy. But that wouldn't work with the asparagus. With the asparagus, maybe an Austrian Gewürztraminer or something. I love Austrian wines, by the way. That's something I've discovered from working a lot in Vienna. I think Austrian wines are some of the greatest wines in the world. They're absolutely fabulous.
Yeah.
And with the oysters, maybe just a glass of beautiful champagne.
Yeah. Well, all of those work. They all work wonderfully well. I'm a lover of seafood, and that would do me as well. It's a very, very nice menu. Toby, it's been a joy, as I knew it would be, through the few times we've chatted or interacted on Conductors in Isolation. Long may that continue. Long may, teaching at the Royal College be a success that it is. And I hope very soon that we can actually meet live over a glass of something and carry on chatting very soon. Thank you.
Definitely, Mike. It's been such fun to speak. And please come and visit me at the Royal College very soon.
A Mic on the Podium was devised and produced by Michael Seal, with music by Ben Dawson. Next time, I chat with a Danish conductor who started out as a professional percussionist, but from the age of 27 onwards, he concentrated on becoming a conductor. He's held title positions in Norway and the United Kingdom, including in Glasgow, where he is currently Music Director of the Royal Scottish National Orchestra. And earlier this year, he started as Music Director of the Minnesota Orchestra in the United States. But until then, bye-bye.